And we're back for part two on transformational HR, strategic human resources for a growing organization. Let's jump back in.
Yeah, we had an expression, when I was senior executive of this public company. Well, forget all the employee surveys and everything like that. But is somebody checked out, or are they still 200% on the job? Do they still sort of have they connected their personal um, um, drive, if you will, to the greater purpose of what the organization is all about? And what we, in every organization that I've been part of, we've been able to sort of wire those two together, partially through training, partially through management, partially through performance management, partially about taking a career perspective on almost all of our employees, and also recognizing that if we couldn't counsel somebody up, we had to counsel them out, right? If they're not enjoying their job, if there's no place for them to grow inside the organization, we had to find a way to find somewhere else, right? And certainly because a lot of the work that I did in my older organizations were all advisory type organizations. It was a lot easier to say, okay, so and so, you know something. Um, Here's a couple opportunities that we found for you at a client, for example. Well, guess what? If they're really that disengaged, they might see that as a very interesting step up. From our perspective, we get a prospective client afterwards because we still want the relationship, but clearly they've checked out, right? There isn't that self-drive. So I think that for me, that was the big thing. We invested in the training, we invested in the retreats, we invested in training, management training, so the managers can actually manage in a consistent kind of way. We expected the senior execs, of which I was one of them, to actually spend time, okay, in the field, meeting with people, not just their direct reports, but the skip level manager meetings, right? So that way, there's a lot more communication. I think that was that kind of investment and senior execs walking the talk, not just talking the talk. I think that goes very, very far because it models a behavior that the next level down, hopefully, will ascertain. With respect to, was it roses everywhere all the time in all the places that I've been? No, 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 no. But you tend to forget about the stuff that was not working so well in the wholeness of all the things that you do and you have done well. I had one manager much earlier in my career who was an absolute tyrant. He was an authoritarian. He was very disrespectful. Okay, and he was quite a bigot as well. And I learned an awful lot from that particular person, how not to lead. Okay, this is much, much earlier in my career. That was great lessons, right? My esteem for this particular person is very low. Okay, but he taught me a very important lesson about treating people in a particular way, but also expecting an awful lot of them so that they could reach up, so that they maintain the engagement that hopefully brought them to you in the first place. So I think that's something that's pretty important. Um, if I were to think of some of my clients where well, let me just answer a different way. So not everybody works in a large organization. Sometimes it's a question of startup or scale up, where there's a lot of change. And here, I think the question of how do you keep people engaged? How do you make it so that there's that alignment and everything's a little bit different in the sense that when you're super small, you want generalists who can jump to a whole bunch of other things, right? Why? Because there's only so many arms and legs. You want to use every single brain cell and every single finger in people's hands to get whatever needs to be done. And then all of a sudden your organization grows. You're 10, you're 15 people, you're 30, you're 50, you're 100 people. And then all of a sudden you start to say, well, one sec, we need specialists here, right? And then all of a sudden the question is, well, what do you do with those generalists? Are you going to promote them into a specialist position? Maybe they are built to be a generalist. So how do you sort of deal with this issue of you've got somebody who got you to a particular point? What do you do with them? That you want to be loyal, but they don't fit. Okay, or they're not okay. Well, first of all, I would say, have you spent time training them? Have you spent time asking them with respect to what their career trajectory they would like to do? Have you invested in them, right? Have you invested in the management team as a group, etc.? So hopefully you can find a place for them, but there's a big issue as an organization grows. At what point do you add specialist skills? the greatest innovation right now is fractional fill in the blank, fractional HR leaders. You do not need to have a full-time, you can't afford a full-time senior HR person to be in a scale up, for example. You may need only 3 days out of 5 or 2 days out of 5, right? Same thing when you're dealing with a startup. You might not, you know, what a senior, mid-senior person can do in 1 day a week is probably more than that cheap resource who hasn't, is using you as a testing ground. Okay, that might take them a week or two, and the results might not be the greatest. So I think fractional is very good. In terms of the Brain Trust Professional Institute, we have no aspiration of growing to 5, 10, 20, 50 people. Been there, done that, right? But for us, it's all about having um, a very focused group of general capability that can address specific client challenges, right? But for many, the question of engagement is a huge one as growth just because of the generalist versus specialist dynamic.
Interesting. I have my next question. Where does the employee's managers responsibilities begin and end with the HR role? Is there cut and dry rules that people follow or don't follow, or it's create your own adventure?
The cut and dry rule about where a manager's roles begin and end, and where an HR leaders, HR managers, um, the cut and dry rule is every organization has got a history of how they do things. Okay. And they've got a future as to how they want to do things in the future. And every once in a while, as an organization grows, there's a new leader who says, this is kind of like half backwards. We need to switch this. We need to put more responsibility for the actual day-to-day people with the day-to-day people managers. There's other organizations that say, well, you know something, trust but verify. Okay, before we approve anything, HR's got to be involved in the situation. Others, it's really more HR is the exception manager, right? But when I talked before about the two story arcs, the long-term strategic and the short-term, etc. I think it's the role of the manager has got to be the day-to-day. And the HR is kind of the go-to if a manager is not sure how to go. The HR is there to keep the manager honest because the manager knows that the person can go to HR with a question or a concern, etc. But the day-to-day, I feel very strongly that should not be the HR. I'm sure there's some type of organization where that makes sense, but for the vast majority, no, right? On the other hand, the other story arc, that longer term story arc, I think that's where HR should be primary as opposed to secondary. What's the whole organizational design question, for example, or the whole um, middle and senior management succession planning rubric, for example, or the management training rubric, or since we started talking about AI much before, that kind of thing, or some of the big I hate to use the word policy, but I'll use the word strategy instead. Some of the bigger strategy questions. Gee, if we decide to outsource, what does that mean from an HR perspective? If we decide to insource and pull stuff from outside, what if, for example, we're going to go forward with a partner strategy? What's the people impact on that? Right? So I think that the longer story arc stuff, it's an HR first. It has to be, right? Because nature abhors a vacuum. If the HR doesn't sort of step into there, it'll be an important voice won't be part of that decision-making process. The buck needs to stop somewhere on that, and the person in charge of people is where it should be. The shorter term stuff, let's put in place the processes and the systems to make sure that the managers have got a consistent way of working with everybody who's there and that they feel empowered because they've got the processes and systems and whatever else to do the job. I'll also say, by the way, that the biggest um, challenge I think that sometimes strategic HR leaders have is that because they're not aligned, they might not personally understand what the pressures are of managers who are in the line, right? And they can hear it third hand or second hand, but because they're not in the line, feeling the pressure of the client service or feeling the pressure of the whatever it happens to be, sometimes you'll be in the clouds and you'll be very good in terms of figuring out the theory, but is it actually workable? And I think that that very big conversation that has to happen When that happens, there won't be the gaps. Okay, but if we think that we know this grand theory or we've got this process, etc., without that interaction, without that socializing certain ideas, without test driving them, etc., sometimes the best longer arc strategies aren't successful, not because they weren't the right strategy, but because the socialization of it or the test driving it, etc., wasn't done.
Randall, some of our clients are multinational, effectively almost global operators. And in these situations, we consistently see that in different geographies, the work culture is different, the work ethic is different, the hours are different. Like when we talk about HR, the best practice is localized HR strategy. I mean, the laws are what they are in that country, the culture is what it is. But we've also seen with clients, there's resentment. Why is it over there? It's this way. Why is it over there? It's that way. Like, can you speak to like ideas of how to overcome those feelings? Like how do you manage that resentment?
So let me abstract away from feelings and resentment for a moment and speak to the challenge between local versus national, local versus global, right? And in the consumer packaged goods world, the formulation of a particular chocolate bar is often different in different geographies, but the branding's the same. Okay, sometimes the creative is the same, sometimes not, sometimes that's localized as well, right? And so the question is what is the difference between, what's the interplay between the corporate culture and the local culture where the operating divisions actually are? For those who are running a smaller business, you've got your organizational culture, your startup culture, if you will. But if you've got everyone remote in different parts of the world, they're operating within a local culture, which is different as well. And I think it's that interplay between the two, and the fact that hewing to that corporate culture and values, and not in a highfalutin way values, but in a very practical way values like we keep our promises. That's a value that is very practical, right? We always return emails within as ASAP when an internal colleague asks, right? That's an internal practical kind of thing that's derived from a value, right? So if we're able to get people, no matter where they are, to buy into these particular values, and at the same time, and it depends on the organization, at the same time help people understand that the reason why we're successful in all these different local markets is because we're able to take advantage of the knowledge of the people within the organization who are on the ground in all these different local markets. And as a result of that, there will be differences in the way we operate. There's a different regulatory regime in every country, for example. There's a different holiday schedule, right? There's sometimes a different way of interacting with clients, customers, with suppliers, etc. Just, sometimes it's a more cultural thing. The culture of Mexico, which is one way, is very different than the culture of Germany, which is, it's a bit stereotypical, but it's true. There's a different speed, if you will, to business in those two places. They're both just as sharp, right? They're both great markets, but they're very different culturally. So the question of how do we make sure that we have employees engaged to retain, and there's a great retention in these different markets is to recognize that, hey, we are good with making some changes here. And by the way, you in this country, you get this. You in that country, you get that, etc. But as long as we hew to those underlying company values, corporate norms, if you will. That's the most important thing. The problem is that sometimes people say, well, this is license to complain. Okay. It's not fair that in my jurisdiction, we only get 3 weeks of vacation when we start, or 4 weeks of vacation. But in France, you get seven, plus you also get a couple weeks off for this and that, whatever. Okay. Gee, why in the UK is it this versus the Caribbean it's that? Gee, why in Canada, which is where we're physically located, is there maternity leaves for a year? But gee, in the United States, we just get 6 weeks or 9 weeks. Like these are such very, very different things. And I think the manager's challenge is to speak to the fact that, hey, we are focused on on building a corporate culture, and we recognize that there are differences culturally, locally. Sometimes we know it's frustrating. Okay, you may see one part of it, okay, but you may not see another part of it. By the way, just from a very practical perspective, what happens if the um, pay scales are vastly different between geographies? Right? You see this even within one country. Why is it that somebody who's working in San Francisco for a high-tech company gets paid this massive amount, but somebody who's doing this exactly the same job, the exact va same value to the end, customer or whatever, um, but they're living in Dubuque, Iowa. Why is there such a big difference? Right? Well, nowadays people kind of understand that, employers will change the pay scales relative to the jurisdiction or the approximate jurisdiction where they are. I know COVID sort of threw that for a bit of a loop, but it actually caused many large organizations and medium-sized ones to say, let's take a look at this a little bit more carefully here. Okay, I just think that the feelings of resentment and everything sometimes are a function of poor management communication or improper or lack of or reduced focus on what brings us together, the common values, the norms, the standards of practice, etc. And through communication, you could address it. But if somebody's using it just as a stick to hit and to complain, you got to call that out too.
Leona, thoughts? A second perspective?
No, I agree. But having worked in international companies, I actually have not heard too much chirping around the fact that, in Europe, the vacation entitlements are much higher.
Hmm.
Yeah, I have to say I've been in the chirping menagerie. Okay, a whole bunch of times and everything, and sometimes complainers have to complain, and that's what they're complaining about. Sometimes it's bona fide. It's a bona fide complaint. Certainly senior leadership has got only so much so much bandwidth to address a lot of these things. So sometimes I would say some of that chirping is, hey, I think we got to spend a little bit of management time sort of addressing, is there a root issue that needs to be addressed, or is it not? I think another big challenge is organizations, for example, that are post-merger, where it's not just a question of different geographies, but post-merger when there's different underlying cultures, right? And now there's new. Is one buying the other and supplanting the culture and all the practices and norms and systems and processes and relationships, or is it something that's a little bit different, right? And it says that a merger of equals, we're going to get the best of both, right? And gee, there's this interim period where there's a lot of uncertainty. And once again, the title of this session is Transformational HR Leadership. Well, guess what? It's not just the transactions or even the existing processes, but particularly if there's a merger or any other major corporate change, what needs to happen there? It's a great question.
You talked about different locations around the world. When you don't have this proximity and ability to meet in person, go offside, any suggestions on how to, not get this demoralized or lack of maintaining excitement?
Yeah, so of course. So the question is about, remote employees or when you outsource stuff to people who happen to be living in another country, et cetera. Part of it is making sure that you know what you're getting into. Are you, for example, hiring somebody and they're 100% dedicated to you? Are you hiring somebody who are actually an employee of some agency that takes care of the local HR, compliance, et cetera, and therefore it's kind of like a three-way relationship, right? Are you, for example, getting somebody who's a contractor who's working for you, but it's also got two or three other little side hustles, and together that makes them, uh, you know, a good living, if you will, right? So understanding kind of where things are, and I think that we didn't really spend time talking about really what the recruiting cycle or the entire HR process, like from beginning to end, is on this particular call, but I would say that uh, looking for a fit, okay, during the recruitment process is really, really important because that's the first time there's any kind of touch points, and that sort of sets the die for all your interactions thereafter, right? And I think whether they're a full-time contractor, a part-time contractor, whether they're an employee of an agency who is full-time or part-time assigned to you, whether they're a full-time employee of yours, etc., you've got to decide, not just for them, but also across all the people at work, how you go about actually making sure that this actually works. I could tell you my last company what we did. We had a number of people abroad. We hired an HR manager who was actually physically in the time zone abroad. And their job was to make sure that the day-to-day HR needs were actually met, right? And accountabilities and so on, right? And that way there's always somebody in their time zone that they could talk to. You know, we had scale, right? So that you may not be there at this particular time. If you look at the people who are abroad as simple work units who just, plug and plug and plug and plug and plug and plug, if that's exactly how they see themselves, perhaps less of an issue, right? But my experience is that oftentimes there's a bit of a disconnect, right? And certainly as they become more key to your operation and you get to know them as individuals, there's little gaps that form there too that need to be closed, right? I'm certainly not perfect myself, but it's something that over the years I've tried very hard to do, particularly with remote people. It's so hard. It's so hard. And I have to tell you, it is so hard when you want the best for them, but on the other hand, you actually don't see them in person. And I know that very intimately. So, my suggestion would be to say, what are you doing in terms of doing team-based training where everybody learns the same vocabulary? How much are you investing in actually doing that rather than you decide to, oh, I'm just gonna, stretch my arms here and I'll be the trainer as well as the one of the founders, right? Um, uh, there's an awful lot of training that can be done exceptionally well via Zoom, right? I'm not talking about generic training, but I'm talking about things that provide them the skills to do what they're doing a little bit more effectively while binding them more closely to your culture and giving you as the leader the language so that you can have those conversations and refer back to that interaction, if you will, that training interaction in a way that makes it easier. Doing it over Zoom is different, for example, than doing, say, a team retreat, like for startups that we do, in person. Why? Because guess what? They got to do a whole bunch of different type of pre-prep, right? We might want to, courier them or arrange for local delivery of a certain package of things that might be used during the team training slash team retreat, etc. There's a whole bunch of stuff, but it all boils down to number one, how do you see that relationship with that particular resource? Where do you see that relationship going? Okay, what's the nature of it? What's the sourcing, recruiting, onboarding that you do with them so that expectations are set? And how do you keep them accountable, right, along the way? So it's a great question. The answer's been solved a whole bunch of times. But when you're rolling up your sleeves, stressing about, whether it's cash flow or a delivery milestone or whatever you're doing, it's very hard sometimes to be keeping the eye a bit more on the horizon. Okay, but the horizon will, you know, it'll bite you if you don't eventually spend some time on that longer story arc.
I have a little comment on that as well. A lot of the remote workforce, you're dealing with Zoom all the time. It tends to be very transactional. I think what becomes important is also to set up times where you're just checking in to learn a little bit more about the person, to warm it up so that it's not just, question answer, checklist, let's review the project milestones. Okay, good, we'll talk to you later. There has to be that personal element. And that's part of, I think, what you're getting at as well, Randall, is around the stickiness, around if this is a person and you want to continue to have them on your team, how do you have them feel involved and how do you do that little piece of having them feel like they belong to the team, that you're not just a paycheck for them. And things you'll have to explore down the road if they're all in the same country. Maybe you go and visit them once in a while. Maybe you do from time to time send something out.
I would just add on to that, and we've got a very, very long list of different things for recognizing employees, etc. That if you ask nicely, we can provide that to you. What I'll also say is this: going out to where they are is one thing. Bringing them to where you are is something as well. And sometimes you think, well, it's a lot cheaper for me to go over there than for them to come over here. But you know something? When somebody says, you know what, they're investing in me so much that I'm so important that I'm coming back to the mothership. I'm going to see kind of where the headquarters is, even if the headquarters is kind of like WeWork, that you rent for the day. That's an incredibly powerful thing. It makes a difference. It says, we care about you. You're actually critical to what's going on here.
It's another topic I want to talk about. We talked about hiring staff, finding, sourcing that good staff, managing them, engaging them. But I want to talk about the HR employees, right? There are different career paths within HR, and different HR professionals have different, focuses of interest. Like, talk to me, like you talked about getting to be at scale and building out that department.
So here's what I think. In some HR groups, it's purely transactional. Okay, so and so is a payroll clerk. Their job is to make sure that payroll is done. That's it. Okay. In others, for example, there's somebody there's a general HR generalist, and there might be somebody focused on recruiting, and there might be somebody else focused on HRIS and database, etc. And that's it. That's it. Right? Others, there's a lot more broader. There's somebody responsible for training, and there's somebody responsible for internal communications. There's somebody responsible for those, etc. The real challenge, I think, for HR professionals, I'm not talking about the chief people officer, chief HR officer, but I'm talking about all the levels below that, is that sometimes there is not space, okay, within the HR department itself for career advancement. And as a result of that, I would make the following I'd make the following two recommendations. Number one, that it's incredibly powerful, and most HR professionals will say this, that somebody does a secondment in another group for 3 months. And so if you're in HR, the idea of saying, is there a particular role within the organizations where you can go out and get out of HR and actually learn a little bit more about what it's like in the field, and perhaps maybe it's a special project, maybe it's being attached to a particular team. I don't know what it is. And then go back. And that kind of career enrichment is very, 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 very powerful. And it makes it a lot more exciting and a lot more relevant as well. That's one thing. Number two is the question of, as an HR professional, where is your professional community? Are you involved in HRPA in Canada or SHRM in the United States? Are you investing in your own professional development amongst the eagles like you, okay, as opposed to being the one or a handful of HR people within an organization, right? What are you doing in terms of getting an HR certification? And building your career that way. And perhaps it's also to say, if you've got aspirations to moving into a more senior leadership position, is to have a conversation with your manager to talk about, not just with respect to the um, individual or annual particular goals, but with respect to the career path. Because it may very well be that rather than leaving and frankly throwing away all the relationships and the systems and processes and culture you like so much, it could very well be that your manager, if they're a very good HR leader, is also thinking about succession planning. And they're also thinking about how we might sort of move people up and around. And to have that kind of conversation at the appropriate time is another way to say, okay, how are we going to do it? Um, I'll maybe make one other comment. The first time I was promoted to manager, I asked my manager, who's the vice chairman of the firm, how were you able to promote me? And he says, I was able to make you a manager, Randall, because you already were a manager. Hmm. So my career advice for HR professionals is to say, if you aspire to do more and get promoted and recognized for it, look around for those special projects where you can distinguish yourself, where you can build out more strength, and where you can not just be seen as the manager or director or VP, whatever the level happens to be, but where by virtue of those experiences, you actually are a much, much better HR professional. So there are two ideas plus a bonus one.
Well, I'm at the point now where I think it's time for Pinocchio to be a real boy. So I've been running a skeleton crew of 6 or 7 guys, and if I get the investment I'm looking for, it means I have to be a real company. with real people in HR and all of these concerns. So I
Well, I
don't
think
even know what I don't know.
yeah, that's a key phrase we use all the time, Barry. I hate to say, gee, I think what you need to do is hire Leona, who's
Okay, good. Let's write this down.
so Barry, you highlighted a phrase that every entrepreneur um, who's honest with themselves should be saying and does. And I know what I know, but I don't know what I don't know. Okay, and so number one, first of all, congrats to getting to the point where you've got where you've got the problem of realizing that this is the case. There's a couple of things that I would say. Number one is the best thing that you might want to do right now is actually not hire an HR leader. Okay, it costs an awful lot of money, right? They're not moving the revenue forward, right? But on the other hand, maybe the idea of hiring a fractional HR leader, okay, is not a bad idea where you might get, for example, 1 day a week, okay, where they could put in place the kind of processes for a company your size that makes sense. Until, of course, you're at 12 or 15 people and you'll need a completely new set of processes and everything. So the idea of doing that is one kind of thing. Leona's right. I coach CEOs on figuring out how to scale their businesses. And I think one of the big issues, and I don't know your business or you really, Barry, but certainly working with a whole bunch of others, I can tell you one of the big issues is is the juice worth the squeeze? Is the money I'm spending on fill in the blank actually going to make a difference, right? Or is that money better spent somewhere else? There's only so much cash that's available, right? And so we have to make sure, particularly if you've got a particular runway of X number of months or a year before you got to go back looking for more financing. Um, and so what I would say is really there's two parts. Number one, there's the let's solve the festering problems by identifying processes and um, cheap and cheerful ways of solving it. Okay. On the other hand, how can we be a little bit more strategic with some of the HR stuff, so that we can make sure that we're actually doing great things, not just preventing problems, right? And not just addressing risk, etc. And if I don't know what your growth trajectory is, but most are focused on not putting in place crazy amount of process at your organization size, but it's really more about gee, what are all the things we can do quickly and cheaply just to move stuff forward, right?
Thank you, Randall, for the conversation. And thank you, Leona, for sharing a second expert take today. And thank you for everyone who joined us live or who listened in. If any of the issues we talked about resonate with you, if you're considering a change and want our perspective on HR or your business in general, if you're planning a leadership retreat, curious about business growth coaching, or how to better align your team, do reach out. We'd be happy to share resources and have a conversation. If you would like invites to these live monthly Q&A sessions, please email us at podcast@randallcraig.com. And we look forward to connecting with you on LinkedIn.